Hello, I'm Susan Flory. This is The Big Middle, conversations about living healthier for longer, expecting more from the extra years the lucky among us are getting in the middle. I have spent the past few days devouring Ravenous. It's a cracker of a science thriller written by my guest, Sam Apple. We learn about the life and work of biochemist Otto Warburg, the German-Jewish Nobel laureate who first proposed cancer as a metabolic disease. And we learn how the diet-cancer connection is now at the forefront of cancer research. Welcome, Sam.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Now, are you talking to me from Johns Hopkins, where you teach creative writing?
No, I'm actually talking to you from the Philadelphia suburbs where I live.
And are you going into the university later, or is it pretty much all remote work now?
It's all remote. It's funny. I started during the pandemic. I've been at Johns Hopkins for about a year, and I have yet to set foot on campus. I hope to be on the campus soon. But
and you were also teaching creative writing for 10 years. Is it University of Pennsylvania?
I teach part-time at the University of Pennsylvania, but I'm full-time at Johns Hopkins.
Well, I loved your book. Fascinating story, beautifully written. I mean, kudos for your finesse at storytelling. How did you first hear about your protagonist, Otto Warburg? Were you instantly hooked, and the minute you heard about him, you knew, I've got to write a book about this?
That's sort of how it happened. I learned about the science first. I was interested in metabolic research. I had read some of the writing of Gary Taubes, a popular journalist who covers metabolic health. And so I had been, kind of curious and reading about these things. And I had learned about the relationship between insulin and obesity and diabetes and even heart disease. And, I was intrigued by all of it, but it all sort of fit with sort of my intuition or what I knew. And then I started to read that cancer was a part of this too, that cancer in some ways could be understood as a metabolic disease. And that really kind of shocked me because I always thought that cancer is a separate realm. Cancer doesn't matter if you're heavy or thin, doesn't matter really anything. It's bad luck, it's random mutations, So once cancer started to seem a part of the story, I was really pretty shocked. But, even so, I'm a journalist and a storyteller by training. And so, before I really take on a topic, I always think about how I'm going to tell the story and is there a character that interests me? And then, just as like a one line aside, I saw in an article that said, the first person to make this discovery about how cancer cells eat was Otto Warburg. And had no idea who he was, recognized the name Warburg because it's a famous Jewish family. I Googled him, I think maybe I don't even remember what I saw first, maybe a Wikipedia page. And I see this just, absolutely incredible story about a gay man of Jewish descent who the Nazis protect because of cancer. And like almost right away, I was, sort of this, oh my God, feeling like here's the character, the science is fascinating. If you have a character and you have the science and you can put that together, that's what I look for in a writing project.
And the color, it just seeps out of your writing. What a fantastic character to find. I mean, as you said, he was a gay man and he was openly living with his lover. I mean, all of the things that the Third Reich abhorred. But Hitler, from what I understand from your writing, he so dreaded cancer, it had killed his mother, that Warburg was protected, but only to a point in the hope that he would cure it.
One of the really interesting things about Warburg is that, despite being in such a uniquely vulnerable position, his father was Jewish, so he was considered Jewish by the Nazis. He wasn't out in the sense of being gay, but it was fairly obvious. I think he lived with his partner. Despite being such a uniquely vulnerable person in Nazi Germany, he actually antagonized the Nazis at every opportunity and really, resisted to the extent that he could in the first years under Nazi rule. So
yes, they were harassing him from time to time, turning a blind eye to the fact that he and his lover were out of their antiques-filled mansion, which you colorfully wrote, and were riding horses every day. But then an official would be sent round in Berlin to get Warburg to sign a declaration of his Aryan descent. And of course, he pushed back hard against that.
Yeah. Yeah, he, they would always try to get him, they were just harassing him. At the beginning, he was a hard person for them to attack. A lot of the younger, less famous Jewish scientists were easy to sort of persecute, and most of them fled in the 1933 around then. But Warburg, he had won the Nobel Prize. He had his foundation, his institute was supported by the Rockefeller Foundation. So he was sort of an international figure, and it made it tricky in the first years under the Nazis to persecute him because, at that time they were still sort of concerned with their public standing in the world. Later, that became less of an issue. But, most people, it would have, been crazy to send away, he would scream at Nazi stormtroopers who came to his institute. But the other, fascinating thing about Warburg, which made him such an interesting character to me, is that in addition to being a genius, he was an extraordinary narcissist. He thought of himself as the greatest person, greatest scientist ever. And, normally somebody who thinks that is delusional, but at some level, he was justified because he was brilliant. He was a genius.
But so arrogant, alongside the recognized genius. It's astonishing, some of the things you write about him and the observations that you managed to weave in from other people saying on a scale of 1 to 10, he was off the scale in terms of, but it comes too as well as having the brain power to do what he did, biochemistry at a Nobel Prize winning level. He came from immense wealth and privilege. The Warburg family, as you said, very well known, embedded in the aristocracy there.
Yeah. Those were his cousins. So he didn't necessarily have, he came from a very privileged background, to be sure. He didn't have necessarily the great wealth of his cousins in finance, but he certainly, his father was a famous physicist who worked with Einstein, and his father had been the rare Jewish scientist to be appointed a chair at the University of Berlin. So Warburg, he grew up with all the famous scientists of, that generation, some of the greatest scientists who ever lived, Max Planck or Emil Fischer, Fritz Haber. They were just, people in his childhood home. And so he grew up thinking that he was a part of that circle, and, he was. And
he had the family name.
Yeah. Yeah. And in World War I, he served on the front, and he only came home eventually when Einstein wrote him a letter saying, this is crazy. You're so valuable for science. We can't afford to lose you. So Einstein is the one who really, maybe saved his life. But anyway, so he thinks of himself and as some sort of godlike figure. And he can't believe the Nazis are harassing him because, who tells Otto Warburg what to do? A lot of people who hated the Nazis hated them for the right reasons because they were doing so many horrible things. But I think Warburg, first and foremost, just couldn't stand anybody interfering with him. That's what really drove his hatred of the Nazis.
Well, I love the color that you put. You said he had a sign up at the institute where he was working in the middle of Berlin, a ritzy section of Berlin, and it said, visitors allowed after 6:30 p.m. So he just put, it was fortress, I'm working, don't bother me. What are you humans on about? All through you sprinkle these details and you really get a sense of the man. He just wanted to focus on what he was doing because, as you said, he was a supreme narcissist as well as a genius.
Yeah. I don't think they usually go together, but in his case, they did.
Now, can you read the bits about the resistance, the couple of paragraphs that really give us a sense of his character?
Okay. Yeah, I'd be happy to do that. So I might reference a few things that won't be clear if you haven't read the whole book, but I think it should be generally pretty clear. Warburg's first show of resistance was to ban his employees from making the Nazi salute or hanging the Nazi flag at his institute. Through 12 years of Nazi rule, he would defy Nazi orders again and again, just as he did in 1934 when he chased the customs official demanding a declaration of Aryan descent out of his institute. On one occasion, a young woman at another institute asked Warburg if she was still allowed to use animals in her experiments, citing reports she had read in the newspaper that it had been forbidden by the Nazis. You should stop reading the newspaper, Warburg told her. In another instance, a group of Nazi officials arrived at Warburg's institute to check on whether everyone present had registered with one of the many new Nazi bureaucratic offices. Warburg, according to Lotte, that's his sister's telling, politely dismissed them, telling them that his employees were working hard and had, quote, no time to deal with politics. On still another occasion, a company of stormtroopers arrived at Warburg's institute and said that 5 of his assistants needed to leave for the day to take part in a mandatory Nazi march. Warburg asked the leader of the group to identify himself and then told the man that he, quote, would burn his institute before he allowed it to be interfered with in such a way. The stormtroopers left and never came back. So that gives you a sense of, how he behaved. And, any one of those things could have gotten him killed. So
yeah, completely. I mean, he was so sure of himself, wasn't he, that he was going to be able to power his way through all of these attempts to control him.
Yeah.
And before we get into the impact of his work, the so-called Warburg effect on cancer research and cancer thinking now, could you talk, please, about the link you make between Nazi ideology and cancer, that both are diseases of civilization?
Yeah, that's actually, my original title that I wanted to use for the book was A Disease of Civilization, because I thought it sort of perfectly captured the two of the intersecting themes in the book. One is the idea that cancer is a disease of civilization, which, that's the civilization in that phrasing is kind of a racist term. Now, I wouldn't say it that way, but that's how everybody talked about it. It's like a disease that now we would say a Western disease or a disease of modern industrial life. In those days, they said civilization. But despite that, I thought it could make an interesting title because that's how it was referred to. And, the irony in a sense of my story is that the real disease of civilization, or the greatest disease, turned out to be not a physical ailment, not cancer, diabetes, but an ideological one, this extreme Nazi ideology. And so I thought that, that title would sort of capture both.
I mean, I've heard the phrase used nowadays too, that almost interchangeably with plagues of prosperity. So, it's all sort of the same bucket. Metabolic syndrome, all of the diseases that are the big killers of now. And then, I mean, you put cancer in there too. The work of Dr. Jason Fung at shining a light on all of that in the Cancer Code, as well as your book. I mean, I think your two books really complement one another.
It's not, I take that as a great compliment. Thank you.
So what do we need to know about Otto Warburg's contribution to cancer research?
Well, I like to start the story at the beginning with this disease of civilization concept about the fact that why is it that cancer didn't really exist in many, non-Western societies, or was extremely rare. So there's kind of a mystery about what is it about modern life that makes cancer more likely to occur. And, we know it didn't exist in those societies in part because there are many doctors who traveled to these remote regions and were just amazed that they didn't find cancer, because they did find cancer in people of similar ages in their own, home countries and their Western populations. So that's kind of the overriding mystery. And some people think that maybe it's a problem of bacteria, or maybe it's chromosomal damage. That was already understood early in the 20th century. And Warburg's hypothesis is that it's a problem of metabolism. It's a problem of how a cell uses energy. And he's thinking about energy because, his heroes are his father and Einstein, who understand the world that way. So he tried to explain that, sort of focus on energy, try to take it into biology. And in 1923, he does this remarkable study where he's trying to see how cancer clearly needs a lot of energy because the cells are growing. Where do they get that energy? How do they power themselves? And I think, his expectation when he goes down this line is that they'll actually use more oxygen, because oxygen is, the main way we burn our nutrients is with oxygen. It provides a lot of ATP, a lot of energy for the cell to use.
What is ATP?
ATP is, the sort of the way that a cell captures energy and then uses it. Like it's referred to as like a currency that the cell can then use to, power itself and carry out all of its functions.
So is that a mitochondrial function?
Well, yeah, in the mitochondria, you burn your nutrients, and then the energy is captured in the form of ATP, and then ATP can be used to power the cell.
All right.
That's not that important for what I'm going to say now. I mean, it is important, but the main thing that Warburg sort of discovered in 1923 is the cells aren't using more oxygen, aren't using respiration, burning food with energy in the way that he would expect. Instead, they're actually doing something else, doing something, really pretty surprising. They're fermenting. They're taking the glucose, and instead of burning with oxygen, they're basically splitting it in two and then quickly breaking it down and spitting it out of the cell in the form of lactic acid. This is fermentation. It's this, the technical term would be aerobic glycolysis, turning to fermentation when there's oxygen available. But it's basically the same thing that gives us beer and wine and cheese and it's used in making bread and everything. And it was just a weird thing that cancer cells were doing this. And it seemed weird also because, normally if you need to grow, you would want to use the mitochondria, you'd want to use oxygen because that's efficient. That gives you much more energy, much more of this ATP. So cancer seemed to be using an inefficient energy source and doing it by sucking up tons of glucose, to keep the energy flowing. They could actually produce a lot of energy, but only by taking up many times more glucose than other cells and then fermenting it. So it was a very weird, sort of surprising discovery. And Warburg became convinced fairly shortly thereafter that this is the whole story of cancer, that a cell becomes cancerous when it switches from respiration to fermentation. And
because of the glucose, there was a link to obesity, or at the time it was called overnutrition.
Yeah, I mean, it became a pop. People had even before Warburg, people had noticed that people that were heavier were more likely to get cancer, and there wasn't much obesity or compared to today, in the 19th century. But people had made that association, but nobody knew, quite what to make of it. I always like to think of it as there's the big picture mystery, the epidemiology, why are people getting cancer? And then there's the mystery of what's going on inside the cancer cell. And, my goal in this book was to try to look at both of those and to see if I could find where they intersected. So, the question I think you're getting at, and correct me if I'm wrong, is, what is Warburg's understanding of how the cell eats have to do with the big picture? Like why is obesity more likely to lead us?
We hear current cancer researchers talk about the Warburg effect. Mm-hmm. And from reading your book, I mean, of course, I didn't understand it in the granular way that you do, because I was, skim reading the book, 433 pages at speed. I mean, really loving it, but of course, not taking it all in it. I understand that the Warburg effect was really popular at the time, but then the rest of the oncology fraternity dropped it like a hot potato in the 1950s in favor of other theories about the causes of cancer.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So Warburg has one leading theory, the problem of the cancer cell is the metabolic change. And there are other theories, but his is one of the popular ones. It's very well respected. He's known to be a genius, so people take his ideas seriously. And then after the war, starting sort of was around a little bit in the 1950s, but then you start to see in the 60s, 70s, it starts to drift away and then almost completely gone by 80s and 90s. Like nobody's thinking about it. Nobody cares about it. It's considered irrelevant. People know, if you stopped a cancer researcher in the 1980s, whatever, and you said, does metabolism play a role in cancer? They might say, sure, cell needs energy, but that's got nothing to do with what's really going on. They called it housekeeping enzymes. It's like it's there in the background, supports the other stuff, and it's not important.
So it's dismissed as just the small fry stuff that was going on. And from what I understand, genetic mutations, I mean, when the genome started to be studied, all of that came to the fore, and people were completely focusing on that as the major drivers of all the cancers, all the serious ones.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. I think that, they started to map out the cancer genes and find specific mutations that, turned on these growth, pathways. And so the Warburg stuff was basic metabolism. It had been figured out decades earlier, and it just seemed irrelevant. And I think the best analogy that I've come across for it is if you think about a computer and everything that's going on the inside and all the hardware and what it's doing, and that's all like the DNA. And then, Warburg was interested in the energy. You think about the plug, and what it sounded to researchers in the 1970s or 80s or 90s, like that Warburg was saying, the whole point of the whole story of cancer is about the plug, not the rest of the computer, about the energy supply. So it sounded crazy. And it just didn't seem relevant. And, and then there's been this amazing rediscovery, and really turns out that analogy doesn't work at all, because the energy actually affects everything that takes place in the cell. So it's not just, you supply the energy and that's it. It changes the behavior of the cell in, profound ways.
You go through a rigorously detailed history of the course of cancer research. And I mean, is his work still considered controversial, or is it sort of settled science? Have people embraced that he was a part of the jigsaw? Even though now, since 2010, from what I understand, cancer research has undergone a bit of a revolution as we come up with different hypotheses for it.
Yeah, no, it's a very good question. It's clear it's made a huge comeback in terms of cancer scientists recognizing that metabolism is important. Now all the major cancer centers study metabolism, and there are journals about it and new drugs coming out. So in many ways, Warburg has been redeemed in terms of convincing, his idea that metabolism is central to cancer. I think he's really been redeemed in that respect. But there's also the sort of micro level debate. Was Warburg right that this specific shift from using oxygen to creating energy via fermentation, was he right about that? And that's more complicated. I think he did actually get some of the specifics wrong, and was so arrogant that he couldn't recognize that. And it's different for different cancers. He may have been right in some cancers. There's a lot of nuance, but I think my summary of it is that he was right in the big picture, but got some of the small details wrong, but it's still controversial.
Well, I like this passage. I noted it here on my screen. Otto Warburg's biography can be read as the story of a visionary whose ideas about cancer were overlooked for too long. It can also be read as a parable of the dangers of certainty because, as we know over the decades, I mean, it's like peeling an onion. Some things that we take as read, now we're sort of looking anew and saying, well, that's only a small sliver of the puzzle. Cancer certainty has a really short shelf life.
Yeah. I tried to always be conscious of that in writing this book, and to make sure that I acknowledge that what I'm saying is only a hypothesis at times when the science isn't entirely clear, because it's certainly Warburg was a genius, but in the last decades of his life, I think, he embarrassed himself on many occasions by making over the top statements that couldn't really be supported with the science at the time. So at the end of the book, I do try to kind of pull it all together in a grand conclusion, but I try to suggest that this is just one hypothesis and that, we need more science.
Well, and do you think we're on the right track now? And I want you to go into some detail about the insulin hypothesis, which you devote the final chapters to, because I was, in preparation for chatting with you, I happened across an article in JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, and I was so surprised. 92 cancer therapies from the years 2000 through 2016 added just 2.4 months to the lives of cancer patients. I found that just incredible when cast against the vast sums that have poured into cancer research. And so This was all happening. And in 2010, if you could maybe focus on the turning point, toward the insulin hypothesis.
Yeah. I mean, I'm familiar with the statistics you mentioned. It's very depressing and frustrating. And I do think that's, one of the reasons that people turn to metabolism and turn to immunology as well, is because it started to become clear that this idea of targeting mutations, finding specific cancer mutations and turning them off wasn't enough. That wasn't leading to, with a few exceptions, wasn't leading to the kind of breakthrough drugs that we had hoped for. So cancer scientists were looking for something new. That's part of the Warburg rediscovery. But I don't want to suggest that metabolism has led to breakthrough drugs yet. There are, a few really promising agents and a few specific cancers, but right now it's too soon to say if metabolism will solve this problem. But I see the most promise in terms of prevention, of understanding, what role metabolism plays in starting a cancer and focusing on prevention through that lens.
And metabolic syndrome. I mean, the killer diseases, the plagues of prosperity that many scientists are focusing on now as explaining so much in the industrialized world and the ultra-processed foods, living in this obesogenic environment. I mean, can you talk a bit about the theories around glucose feeding cancers? They starve if you deprive them of sugar.
Yeah. Yeah. So, the way that I like to think about it is, I said before that, there's the mystery of what's going on in the cancer cell, and then the mystery of what's going on in a population, the epidemiology. So in my mind, it all really it comes together in the late 1990s in a kind of an extraordinary way. Warburg is being discovered, and cancer scientists are discovering the cancer cell. That Warburg was right, that the glucose uptake is huge to cancer, that the cells thrive on glucose. And, one of the amazing things is that there was this common test, which is still a very important test, this PET scan, which all it really does is show you where in the body cells are taking up extra glucose. And that's how you diagnose cancer. So, it's kind of in a way staring cancer scientists in the face. And they start to think about, all right, so the cells are dependent on glucose, and that's clearly an important part of cancer. And at the same time, the people that study the population levels for the first time started to see, like, oh my God, like obesity really does correlate very strongly with cancer, much more than any specific food. So these two things happened in the late 90s. And, the last part of my book, I try to understand, like, why do these things, what do they have to do to each other? What does the eating of the cancer cell have to do with, obesity being related to cancer? And the hypothesis that I explore is that the best explanation is insulin, that insulin is, this hormone that we all have, and that when you have a metabolic disease, metabolic problem, you have higher levels of insulin. And I think that the best evidence, the best hypothesis is that the insulin is driving both the obesity and the higher cancer rates. And I can say more about that. I don't want to go too far into the weeds.
No. I love it because, this is some of the terrain that I bring to the fore on the Big Middle. I've had some really illustrious guests speak about this. Dr. Ben Bickman, Prof. Tim Noakes, Tucker Goodrich here in the UK, Graham Phillips. So lots of great people who have spoken about these things with me, and, constantly learning about this, because we know that a lot of these sugar-fed cancers are the ones that we're looking at. So it all feeds into, again, the plagues of prosperity and our obesogenic environment and the addiction that big food has generated with giving us these bliss point foods. And I think it's ruined a lot of lives. So, I mean, you're the expert because of all the writing and the exploration you did of this. I want to bring up something that I was fascinated by, because you point out that Hitler would have been a prime candidate for one of these sugar-fed cancers because he was a sugar addict.
Yeah. I mean, throughout the book, I weave in Hitler's story as well, because it intersects with Warburg's story in such profound ways. And because, the Nazis had this very strange cancer fixation, which, I found fascinating and disturbing in all sorts of ways. But Hitler also was an extreme sugar addict. And, it's hard to know what his metabolism was like, because he also took various drugs and was really a drug addict as well. But, he was very paranoid of cancer. And before he became an extreme drug addict was, showing a lot of signs of metabolic syndrome. So I don't, to clarify, I don't think that being a sugar addict made Hitler that had anything to do with Nazism, but it's just kind of an interesting, story to add in as I'm explaining all the rest. And
well, it sounds like he was living on sugar lumps in his tea, and his housekeeper, you brought up a very interesting point. She just kept making cakes all day, and the next day they were all gone. And he had been the one that was eating them all.
Yeah, no, the testimonies where I've never read anything like it. I don't know that there's ever been a person who consumed more sugar in short periods. He was a madman, came out in many different ways. And, that was one of them.
Yeah, I mean, he was running on sugar, running the war on sugar from the sounds of it. Back to the diet cancer connection. Your new book spans, I read, 5 years of detective work. It took you 5 years. Were you finding it difficult because you've got a family, you've got children? I can't imagine how much time you had to devote to digging up all of this information. Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, it was really hard. I do have 3 children and, teaching and stuff. So it's hard. But, the hardest part probably is, one, many of the guests you have on the show are brilliant scientists. I'm not, I'm a journalist. So I had to really learn a lot of the scientists, a lot of the science, and we'll never understand it in the way that some of your other guests do. So, the same challenge that you might have in going over some of this stuff.
Completely.
But, yeah.
Completely. I
But,
always find I have to listen back to the episode because people are saying, well, I disagreed with that point that this person said. And did he say that? Because you
yeah,
do all the research and you try to make it stick in your
yeah,
brain bank. And then you do the episode and you really do need to listen back several times to get all of it, all of the learning that it presents.
yeah, yeah. So that was hard. And then on top of that, so many of my sources were in German, and I'm not a fluent German speaker or reader, so that was really hard. A lot of times I had to, I'm looking at like German stuff from like the 19th century and extracting it from PDFs and getting it translated, and just really slowed down the process a lot. So,
No doubt.
yeah, I don't think I'll ever try something like this again. It was a one-time thing.
Well, superlative storytelling, great effort. And I do want to know, in light of the insulin hypothesis and all of your deep digging, have you changed your food habits? Maybe ditched the sugar, given up the starchy carbs?
Yeah, I had sort of done it beforehand. I don't think that some cancers are, I don't like to, I think you can really prevent type 2 diabetes just by following a certain diet. Some cancers are bad luck. There are no guarantees in cancer, but I think the safest thing you can do is to, first and foremost, get all sugar out of your diet. When I say sugar, I don't mean all gluten. When I'm saying specifically like table sugar, the white stuff, because some of the carbs we eat are just glucose, but sugar is glucose plus fructose, and fructose is, I write in the last part of my book, I think that's the most dangerous molecule of all. So I
It
avoid.
invades the liver, doesn't it? That's why I ditch sugar as well.
Yeah,
It just
yeah,
takes over, and people don't seem to realize
yeah. It
fructose
seems,
is a real problem.
yeah. I mean, it drives the insulin resistance more quickly than anything else, I think, and that that's what you want to avoid is the insulin resistance. So if you are insulin resistant in particular, I think you certainly want to avoid the sugar, the white stuff. But if you're already insulin resistant, as unfortunately most of us are, most adults in America at least, then you usually will have to bring down carbs to reverse that insulin, not just sugar, but most carbs. So that's what I would do, not just for cancer, but for general metabolic health.
Yeah. I mean, hyperinsulinemia, 80% of the populations in the industrialized world. Just look at OECD countries. I mean, you might be the highest, 80%. The UK isn't far behind, nor is Australia or Canada.
Yeah,
So, we're all having to learn about this
yeah,
ourselves because mainstream advice is still stuck on low
yeah,
fat and cholesterol's bad and all the rest. Now,
yeah.
I want to get your publisher put a great blurb. I wrote it down here. It says, a tale of scientific discovery, personal peril, and the race to end a disastrous disease. Ravenous would be the stuff of the most inventive fiction, were it not, in fact, true. And I'm just wondering how long it's going to take. I mean, your book isn't in hard form yet. I mean, I read it in draft. Thank you very much. I think this is the first interview you're giving, isn't it? That'll
Uh,
go out into the wild before publication. What is it, third week in May?
yeah, May 25th in the United States, and then late June in Europe and the UK.
Well, I think the producers and directors are definitely going to be calling because it screams movie. Who would you like to see in the role of Otto Warburg?
I would be delighted if it came to that. I honestly, I hadn't. Good question. I really, maybe you have a better idea than I do.
Were Alan Rickman still alive? I'd slot him right in there. And then I was thinking, do you know the Irish actor Kieran Hines?
I know the name, but I'm not sure. Part of working on the book for 5 years, I lost touch with everything else.
No doubt, because it's. I mean, you really put so much detail into it and color, and your writing is so concise. It's not lardy at all, which I really love as a broadcast journalist. We kind of get rid of every adjective, so I really appreciated it. Now, final thing I want to ask you is there a question that I've not asked that you'd like me to ask?
Oh, that's a great question. You did a great job of covering the whole range. No, I guess you didn't really, I wouldn't expect you to ask this, but I just like to add too that, in my dedication, I dedicated this book to all those who helped, because it was a tremendous amount of work for me, but I could not have done this book, and this is not false modesty. I could not have done it without people helping me again and again with translation, people in archives, like digging through the archives on my behalf. Like, I kept thinking of this cliched line, like it takes a village. I feel like it took a village of people helping me to do this project. So I'm really grateful for that.
And hats off to you. You are devoting the money that you make from sales of the book to metabolic research.
Well, yeah, I should clarify that. I put a link on Amazon, and if you buy it on Amazon, then it pays a commission to me, and then I'm donating all that money to cancer research. But I didn't mean to suggest that I already spent the money for the advance just to survive over these last 5 years. But
of course,
all the Amazon commissions I will be donating.
Laudable. Thank you so much. And I guess before I go to, I want to say, this isn't your first book. And I love the book. If you can just give me a top line about a couple of your other books. Schlepping Through the Alps sounded fascinating. You tracked an Austrian shepherd who was singing in Yiddish to his sheep.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of, it's a very different book. It's first person and it's memoiristic in some ways. And I travel with this eccentric character, but there are some parallels. I was attracted to this shepherd, in the same way I was attracted to Warburg. He's a fascinating character. And then it's a story about Nazism and resistance to Nazism. So there are a lot of parallels, even though they're very different books. And then my second book for adults was called American Parent. And that's when I really started to become a science writer. I was interested in the first year of a child's development and what I could learn about, being a better father, and sort of studying the science there.
Sorry, go ahead.
I hadn't trained as a science journalist, but that's when I sort of taught myself how to do it a little bit.
And you also put out the quirkiest book of all for kids. Tell me the title of that book about a boy's reluctance to sit on a certain bowl in a certain room.
I was afraid we were going to go there. It's called The Saddest Toilet in the World. And it was really just that, my kids were little and potty training. And I was just joking around with my agent one day, said it would be a funny idea if there was a book about a toilet who was offended by the fact that the kids don't want to use them. And my agent was like, let's do it. That's actually pretty funny. So I just wrote it up and he sold it. So it was a lot of fun.
It was quite popular, I understand.
Well, I mean, I don't think it was a bestseller, but I still get a lot of emails about that book. So it was fun. I do a lot of humor writing in my spare time. I don't have it anymore, but when I do get a chance, I like to do, humor writing.
Well, I'm sure your kids will adore it as they get into their teen years. They'll look back and say, I was the inspiration. I was my dad's muse for that.
It's more, they're mostly just embarrassed by me.
That's a good spot to be in as a dad, I think. Most dads would agree. Listen, Sam Apple, thank you so much. I want to just do a little bit of an up-sum of what you do. You teach science writing and writing in general to master's students at Johns Hopkins University. You taught creative writing and journalism at the University of Pennsylvania for 10 years. At the outset, you said you still do the odd bit of teaching there too?
Just very part-time there.
And feature writing journalism, who hasn't he written for of all of the big titles? New York Times Magazine, The New Yorker, The Atlantic, Wired, The Los Angeles Times, The Financial Times, and many other publications. I listed only a few of them. Thank you so much for writing Ravenous, Sam. Epic work. It was so good to sit down. Even in draft, as my eyes were bulging out from too much screen time, I really, really liked it a lot. And I learned a lot.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. It's really, after working on it for all these years, it's so rewarding to get a nice response like that. So thank you.
Well, among the many 5-star reviews for Ravenous, I will share this one from the brilliant Dr. Ben Bickman, the author of Why We Get Sick. I had the pleasure, as many will know, of speaking with him on the podcast a few weeks ago. He writes, Ravenous reads like a cancer mystery with the larger-than-life Otto Warburg in the role of the determined detective. By learning of the scientific struggles of the past, you'll gain a new appreciation for the modern focus on hormones such as insulin in the development of cancer. So fantastic. That's one of many great reviews you've got on the back cover.
Thank you.
Okay, Sam Apple, that is all she wrote this time. In the weeks ahead, I've got Andy Cope coming on the podcast, the Doctor of Happiness, don't you know? Georgie Lee and Colm Lowe on the UK's shiny new Design Age Institute. And we'll be talking about how to smash sugar addiction with the brilliant Dr. Jen Unwin. Thank you so much for your generous support of this podcast, your lovely reviews, and for hitting those subscribe buttons wherever you see them. Until next time, ciao for now.